to take out your charts from yesterday, and I need you to take out the passage real quick. Let's look at the actual passage. Okay, so I want you first to look at your passage, and I want you to look at the prompt. Remember back to when we did the great influenza, right? And the steps that NIMSY assignment took us through, right? It took us through, like, what do we think about scientific research? What do we know? What do we not know? What can we assume, right? It walked us through. Did you take the time in the 10 minutes that I gave you to do that with this prompt? That would be a no, right? Okay, so what I want you to notice are a couple of key things. One, I want you to notice that we get the who, we get the when, right? We get the where. Now notice this idea, the first month of the Civil War. That's a little nugget. You need to mark it as a nugget. Okay? When the College Board gives you nuggets, they give you nuggets for a reason. Okay? Sometimes they're going to expect you to understand historical context. Okay? We know that 1860, right? Like that, starting in the Civil War right there. But for them to tell us that it is the first month of the Civil War is important for some reason. And we need to make note of that, okay? The next thing that you need to look at is a couple of things. One, right, African Americans were not yet permitted to join the Union Army. That's another little nugget. Because if you didn't know that, they're telling you that that's a historical context that you need to understand. Okay? But Green felt that they should strive to be admitted to the ranks and prepare to enlist. Read the speech carefully. Then write an essay in which you analyze the methods that Green uses. The methods. That right there is another little nugget because it tells you how to organize your paper. How are you going to organize it? By his methods of persuasion. Okay? That Green uses to persuade his fellow African Americans. Hello, he is black. How many of you missed it? Fess up. Do it. Fess up. You didn't read the prompt. If you missed that piece of evidence, right, it's another little nugget. They're not expecting you to know who Alfred Green is. What does that change? If you know that he is an African American, what does that change for you? His point of view, his purpose. He's not some just random white dude getting the black people to come up north and go, come on, come join us, please, we need more people. It is one of their own. In the first month of the Civil War, so it was a bloody war, right? He's already begging them to come join them that early before it gets bloody. So he already knows how intense the fight is going to be. Does that make sense to you? If you missed that, you missed the entire purpose. I could probably almost guarantee you wouldn't pass that passage. Right? Look at your prompt. Did you mark it? You should have. Look at your annotations. Do they look like that? You need to stop marking whole paragraphs. You need to look at little things. Look at little things. Right? Notice you have a little star in there. That's another nugget. It's really important that they're telling you that you understand who Dred Scott is. So if it's an illusion that they think that you don't know, I mean, that, if anything, you should mention in your paper. Because they're giving you that nugget. Does that make sense? Okay? I gave you 10 minutes to read and annotate. It should have looked like that. How many feel like your annotation is close to that? You need to get over the stress of the time. I'm trying to prepare you for the time. So in those 10 minutes, all you need to prepare for is that passage to read and annotate. It should look like that. I did that in 10 minutes. No, I mean, I'm awesome, but you'll get there. You have to find more. You have to find more than just repetition. You have to find more than just underlining paragraphs. Yes? Okay. So I just wanted to kind of show you what that should look like. Okay. Now what I want you to do is I want you to look at your charts. So let's look at the first essay. And why, oh why did I love this essay? There's a reference to A Tale of Two Cities. And you know I love A Tale of Two Cities. Okay. So look at the intro paragraph, right? Did you feel The Tale of Two Cities was a little contrived? Do you feel like it was trying too hard?
Yes.
Why?
Because they
This wasn't my paper. This was from the College Board. So this was somebody that didn't even know me. But when I saw it in the samples, I was so excited.
It was forced.
I disagree completely. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Wrote Charles Dickens in A Tale of Two Cities. This quote applies to the situation in which African Americans found themselves at the onset of the Civil War. What is he already setting up? It's historical precedent, right? This same thing had happened during the French Revolution, right? The same kind of experiences. And now it's happening here. It's really actually kind of insightful. All right? Then notice that first half is all background. Look at the poster on the wall. What do I tell you to put in your introductions? Historical context. Do they have historical context? Check. Next thing, who, when, where? Alfred M. Green. Looked beyond the bad times to the good. Very clever to respond back to what he said. And encourage African Americans to fight for their right to serve their country. There's his purpose, right? Okay, so then you get into his actual paper. Notice that he talks about, now he's talking about how he organizes it. Now, he says, Mr. Green begins the speech with the talk of duty and patriotism. Now, what do we not like there? What do we not like right there? The quotes. It's just a drop, right? But remember we said when you grade a paper, do you grade it down for the things that it doesn't do well? No. So we kind of look past that. We move past it, right? Okay, so at the next part, it is their duty to serve their country. That's a little bit of summary, right? But then he gets into the purpose, right? African Americans must show the world that they are filled with pride for their country and are willing to fight for freedom. Does that go back to that purpose? Yes. Okay, so I want to look over a couple more things in this one. Notice he is talking about, he is using the language of argument, right? In the second and third paragraphs, Mr. Green qualifies the fact. What does it mean to qualify an argument? We haven't done that yet, but we will. But what does it mean to qualify your argument? Kind of. If you qualify your argument, you're saying, this is okay here, but in this situation, it's different. Okay? So you're qualifying, it's a little bit of clarifying, right? So it would be along the lines of, abortion is not okay, but it is when blank. That's qualifying. Okay? So notice he uses the language of argument there. He talks about illusions. He has the purpose, right? What did y'all give X? Passing?
Yeah.
Up or lower? Okay. Look at your lower and look at your scoring guide. Y'all are harder than I am grading. I didn't think that was possible. All right, so what does your scoring guide say for upper or lower? You're looking at inadequate or adequate, right? So you guys that said, how many of you said that this is a failing paper? So in a failing paper, you're saying that there is not one piece of purpose. Not one. Did we just talk that there was purpose at least in the first body paragraph? Yes. So it's at the very least, it's a, what? It's at least a 5. How many of you gave it a passing score? Good for you. Woohoo! Your high five. Okay. How many of you gave it a 6? Gave it a 5?
Yeah.
5s? Okay.
A few more.
Yes?
Do you have Audrey?
Adere
Yeah.
and Jerry.
Yes.
Stand up. This is a good thing. Yay! No stress. Yeah, congratulations, because now what? What is that for? Read it.
NHS.
NHS, like whatever. It's not a big deal. That's awesome. Congrats.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so those of you that gave it a passing score, did you give it a 5?
Yes.
Passing score 5? Okay, y'all are going to be blown away. It's a 7. What? Okay, now let me tell you. Do y'all remember talking about, I said, for scores that are prior to, let's say, 2006, you're going to see it kind of a change in scoring, okay? This essay is from 2003, so we're talking 10 years ago, okay? Our test has changed a lot since then. So this 7 then, I would probably say would score closer to a 6 now. But every year it changes, right? A 6 last year may not look like a 6 this year. Last year's rhetorical analysis was the hardest rhetorical analysis and the lowest scoring one ever in the history of the exam. Ever. Poor children last year, right? Aren't y'all like, thank God. Okay? So know that what was a 5 this year may look very different next year. Okay? So let's look at what they said about the 7 and why it scored a 7. All right. So typical of many 6s in terms of its level of analysis, the essay rises to the score of a 7 because of its mature prose style. In your chart, did you mention something about their writing style? What did y'all mention under their writing for X? Did you write anything down for that? Sam, what'd you mention? What'd you say about it?
Well, our group had said that it was simplistic.
Oh.
A little less.
Okay, a little less persuasive. Okay. Y'all are more critical than I am. That's awesome. I'm just going to stop grading and let y'all grade. Do what? You gave it a 3. So listen, and I know when y'all start grading these that y'all have seen me grade yours, and so automatically you're like, that's terrible, right? Because we laugh at ourselves in here, right? But what you have to do is you have to start looking critically at things that they do well, right? So remember, when I'm grading yours, I put checks when I find it, right? And those checks bring the score up. So you need to kind of start to recognize that, okay? Notice what else it says. So it says that they kind of follow the Green speech in chronological order, right? Which works. They talk about how appropriate Green's choices are for his audience. He addresses the appeals, but he doesn't really talk about why they're suitable for the audience, okay? So again, it's a 7. I'd say it's a low 7, right? In the house of each score, you have high 7s and low 7s. You have high 5s and low 5s. So that's kind of where you see me do the plus or minus, right? But when you get your overall score, it's just going to be a solid 5, right? But that's why we score plus or minus. Does that make sense? Plus it helps your grade out a little bit, right? Okay. All right, so we're shocked by that. Let's look at double O. Bye. What do you think of the double O?
I can't read it. The handwriting.
Oh my God, get over it. Y'all have to read 150 of y'all. So y'all know how bad your handwriting sucks? Girls' handwritings are not always good. Yeah. Okay. So no, but okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the bad handwriting. Did it take you more time to get through the essay because it was bad handwriting?
Yes.
What does that tell you about your own paper? Handwriting, it is kind of important. Okay? Know that they will struggle to get through your essay, even if poor handwriting. Okay? But sometimes I see like scribble. I mean, literally, it's just like bumps on a piece of paper, and I have to kind of figure out what those bumps mean. Okay? And it's a struggle. Okay? So this one actually is really not that bad. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, just, you should wait. Okay, so you have the introduction. It has a 1-sentence introduction. Not great, right? But it's there. It goes in, it talks about organization, right? Talks about the first paragraph, the next paragraph. So they're trying to work their way through. They have a little bit of purpose in there. They have pieces of evidence. They have an attempt at analysis with emphasizing their point, right? That pink part is their purpose. So they're talking about the language. So because we found purpose, this is it's a 5. If it makes you feel a little bit better about your own paper, right? Hopefully. If there is any part of purpose in a paper, it is a 5 at the very least, if it is on topic. That makes you feel good, right?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Kind of, yes. Okay. All right. So that one's a 5. So know in the future, you're going to start to be graded on how you grade other people's papers, the accuracy. So you're going to have to start looking at people's papers more critically, but more accurately. Did you have conversations about that scoring guide? You should have gone in and looked at it very critically because you would have seen a little bit of purpose in this. Just a little bit. Makes you feel a little better. Yeah. 1s are hard to get. 1s are hard to get. If there is an attempt and they're on topic, then a 1 says that they didn't even understand the passage. This person clearly understood that passage. They are not a 1. At the very least, they would start at a 3 or a 4. Even summary is 4, usually. Okay? All right. So now what I need you to do is I need you to take out your SPI. Okay, so we have talked about SPI. We've talked about assertions. For the most part, we are pretty on point with our assertions. All right? So what I want you to do now is I need you to pick colors. Okay? So for me, my support is going to be pink. Okay? Now notice I have these posters over here to the left, right? So if you ever get lost, you can go back and try to remember. Now, one of the things about support is notice this is where your evidence goes. And notice that your evidence must have language in it. This is what we struggle with. If there is no language in your evidence, then you're kind of at a roadblock. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to analyze. Okay? My purpose is going to be blue. Again, yours can be whatever color you want. Now, notice the questions that come with the purpose. Okay? It will explain why the author uses the device or technique. It answers the question, how does it contribute to the piece as a whole? It says, how does your piece of evidence support your assertion? What is its purpose? Notice this. Never discuss a device without connecting it to the purpose and the how or why it is used. So if you're going to throw out there that you're going to label something a metaphor, you better talk about the purpose of that metaphor, right? So why did Jonathan Edwards choose to use the raging waters or the dam building up as an example of God's wrath, right? And a lot of you did a really good job in identifying that, and you talk about the purpose of that metaphor. It creates the idea of this building up, this pressure that continues to build up, that eventually, if it is not let out at some point, it will burst through that dam, just as God's wrath will burst through, right? So you have to talk about purpose. One of the things that I'm seeing is you guys are talking about paralleling. He's paralleling ideas, but one, you're not having any parallelism in your piece of evidence. It may be later, you may give one piece of the sentence but not give a second piece, so I don't know where the parallel is. Or you're saying it parallels, but then you're not telling me what it's paralleled to. Does that make sense? Okay, and then you have insight. Mine is going to be orange. Okay, now this part is hard. So this is defined as your capacity of understanding hidden truths, your perception, your sensitivity. That's why it's hard. I can't teach you that. Okay? You want to look at the bigger picture of the piece, or does it connect to anything you know in history or any worldly views or events? This is the reason we're going to start reading Upfront magazine, and we'll talk about that next week. And that you guys need to start watching the news because we need to understand current events. Okay, so your body paragraphs should have 2 chunks plus insight. So you should have your SP, and then your I. That is the very minimum. For a body paragraph. Okay? All right, take out the sample that you just picked up front. All right, top right-hand corner. Now you have your colors. Okay, so mark your colors. So my support is pink, and this is out of order, but my support is pink. My purpose is blue. My insight is orange. All right, so everything that we are about to do to this paper, you have to do this weekend for your own paper. Thank God I didn't grade it, right? Okay, so everything that I'm marking, bless you, or highlighting, I need you to mark as well. Okay? All right, so let's start. The Civil War, a war fought during the 1860s, decided a great many things: slavery or freedom, South and North, or unification. In the beginning of the war, the Northern African Americans were not allowed to join the Union Army and fight against the Southern oppressors. Alfred Green, while giving a speech in Philadelphia at the beginning of the war, urged African Americans to prepare to enlist. He also spoke subversively about the unfairness of the treatment of African Americans not only in the South but also in the North. Green uses a variety of methods to persuade his fellow African Americans to prepare for war while also speaking out against the treatment of the African Americans in the North. Okay, so look at the posters on the wall and tell me what goes in, over here, what goes in your intro paragraph. Let's find the first thing. Okay, where is the historical context? These first, 4 lines. Okay? That is historical context. So mark it as historical context. So I need you to find all these things in your paper. Okay, what's next? Who? Okay, so we have our who. So here's our who. Alfred Green. We have our where in Philadelphia. And we have our when, beginning of the war. Okay, what else do we need? The thesis. So in the thesis, we have our little idea, right? Here's your little idea. African Americans to prepare to enlist. That is actually in our prompt, right? So we could put our finger on it. So in our thesis, we have our parts, right? We have our little idea. What else do we have? The big idea. So where's your big idea? African Americans to prepare for war. So there's your big idea. Yep, while speaking out against the treatment of African Americans. So there's your second kind of big idea. Okay, what else goes in our thesis? Marker verb. Okay, so I would say here's your marker verb, persuade. And finally, tone. Subversively. Check, check, check. Right? Everything in there? A little spread out than what we do? Yeah, but that's okay, right? We're following a formula. Once we follow the formula, in the spring you'll loosen up and you'll step away from that formula. Okay? So, looking at that, are you saying upper half or lower half? Upper. Okay? Okay, now, let's move next. Green begins his speech by immediately mentioning the cornerstone of the American ideology, that American citizens believe in freedom and of civil and religious toleration. Okay, so we need to mark our assertion. Is that an assertion? Is there an assertion in there? Is there an assertion in there? Yes, apparently there is, because I'm asking, right? It is blended with the piece of evidence. Do we like that? Not so much, but we're going to look past it. So here's what I do. When I grade your papers, I find what you're trying to assert. So what are they trying to assert? The idea of the cornerstone of American ideology. That is their assertion. Your assertion should not be a device. Okay, that American citizens believe in freedom and the civil, religious, and toleration. What is that in our colors? Support. And that should be by reminding the African Americans what America is founded on, he incites in them the desire to go to war against anyone opposing the idea. What is that? Okay, now, here's what I need you to do. We need to not just say, oh, well, there's a piece of evidence, so the next sentence has got to be support or purpose, right? So you need to look and see, what did we just box? American ideology. Does that sentence right there explain why freedom and of civil and religious toleration goes back to American ideology? Yeah, it does, right? Because here's this purposeful statement, by reminding. Right? So here is a reference, right? So here's the language. So he's basically talking about an allusion there. And notice, this is not he tugs at their heartstrings and makes them feel guilty. Right? Because that says nothing. Notice what it does. It incites them the desire to go to war against anyone opposing the idea. Green, by the same token, reminds the whites of their unfairness in denying the African Americans their rights. What is that? Support is evidence. Is there evidence in there?
No.
What is it still talking about? Still talking about purpose of up there, right? Of that piece of evidence. Okay, so it's still purpose. And you have to look at your own writing very critically and say, does that sentence go back to this boxed idea that I have and still connect to the support? The mention of the immortal Washington and Jackson also appeals to the patriotism in the African Americans, moving them closer to desiring to fight in the war. All right, what color do I need? Support. Where does the support start? We're gonna do the blending part. So the mention of immortal Washington and Jackson. What's the rest of that sentence? Purpose. Notice, again, we are not talking about ethos, logos, or pathos. Somebody at the door. Hi, love.
Can I come sit in your class?
You can. I'm videoing, so
Sounds fun.
yeah. Alfred Green, feel free to chime in.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you have the appeals to the patriotism. So notice that this is not heartstrings, right? But what kind of appeal is an appeal to patriotism? Hello? It's what? Is it pathos? Yeah, I would say it's more ethos, right? But you're saying what type of ethos is it? You're saying it's talking about the patriotism. Does that make sense? So see, you're identifying it, but you're not talking about ethos. Okay? All right, next. The appeal Green makes to the religious beliefs of the African Americans is apparent throughout his speech. Okay, so there's his assertion. What is his topic of his assertion? Religious beliefs. Because most of the African Americans at the time were Christian, by referring to their God as the God of truth, justice, and equality to all men, makes the African Americans feel obligated to help the cause of the Civil War. So what do we have in the beginning? Because most of the African Americans at the time were Christian. Purpose. Yeah, I would say it's purpose. You'll see insight here in a minute. We don't really know what it looks like, but we'll look at it here in a minute. Okay, so because most of them were Christian, by referring to their God as the God of truth, justice, and equality to all men, what is that? Support. It makes the African Americans feel obligated to help the cause of the Civil War. What is that? Okay, so something I want you to notice here. Okay, notice above, right? Up here you have support and then purpose separate, right? And then notice here you have support and purpose blended in the next one, right? And then notice here you have purpose, support, and then purpose. So notice that the variety at which they are creating their chunks. Does that make sense? Now remember, for us, we have taught you support separate, purpose separate, right? And that's okay, because we're going to follow a formula until we feel comfortable. But look at the variety at which you can include your evidence, okay? That's a higher level of understanding. Does that make sense to y'all? All right. Because their God believed in freedom, why and how can they deny anyone else that right? I would say it's insight. Now, what I'm going to say that I don't like is, Carly, can you help with this one? The question. Don't ask questions. This writer does it and does it really well. We can't do it that well. Not yet, at least. When I hear you ask questions in your paper, basically what you're telling me is you don't know what else to write. Right? How could he do that? Question mark. Right? Notice that this is insight, because you could change that statement to a question to a statement, and it would be very insightful just as a statement, right? But he's using a rhetorical question really well. Okay, at the same time, Green also reminds the whites that their same God is the white God, and that the African Americans deserve rights as well. What is it? Why do you say it's purpose? At the same time, Green also reminds the whites that their same God is the white God. What is that? He reminds the whites that their God is the same as the white God. He specifically does that in the passage. So what is that? Support. And that the African Americans deserve rights as well. That's support. That is implicit. Remember how we talked about examples being explicit and implicit? Explicit being direct text, implicit being a paraphrase, a reference. So notice now that you have somebody that has explicitly referred to the text and now implicitly referred to the text. Check, check. Right? Higher level. Okay. Green also wants the African Americans to be trusting in God because their God wants them to go to war and will protect them. What is that? We have support where? Yeah. Notice, what I want you to notice some of these transition words into analysis. Why should the African Americans not go to war under such protection? It's insight. Because basically he's saying that that is what Green is implying, right? But again, stay away from the question. All right. By the end of his speech, Green begins to remind the African Americans of their oppressed brethren in the South. Okay, even though he's using the language, there is what he is asserting. And what you see here is you see the language of the speaker used as the writer's own language. It's hard. Don't do it. You will see a couple of 9s that will show us how the writer uses the speaker's own language to really prove the writer's higher thinking, their insight, but we're not there yet. He reminds them of people under a tyrant system and requests their assistance in overthrowing that. What is that? He also mentions the desire of the Southern leaders to drive back civil and religious freedom and have more slave territory. What is that? Yep. Okay. By mentioning the goals of the other side, he motivates the African Americans to battle by showing them the future of the nation if the South wins because they did not battle. Or they did not fight. Purpose. Yep. Green notes that their very presence on the battlefield will urge the slaves in the South to revolt. Support. Green's word choice put a little sad face, crying. Green's word choice throughout his speech helps him to motivate the African Americans to battle without their realizing it. Okay, so here is really what they're asserting. What would be a better way of saying without them realizing it? Subconsciously. Yes, somebody last period said unconsciously. No, unconscious means you're passed out. Okay, which some of them may have been. I don't know. Okay, so there's what we are asserting. So notice what I need you to do is I need you to box what it is that you're asserting, right? Okay. He constantly uses the phrase, "let us," to persuade the African Americans to join the army without directly telling them to do so. Where does the support start? He constantly, right? And then does it stop anywhere? Okay. Okay. Purpose. A direct order is much less likely to be followed than a softer direction, such as let us. I would say it's insight, yeah. But notice how I feel like sometimes we try to do insight, but then we go on and on and on. Notice that it's in and out. One sentence, clear, get out, right? He also includes himself in the group by using the word us, making him seem motivated and desirous of joining the army as well. What do you have? Yep. All the way up to making, right? Okay. If he desires to join, why should they not? Green also anticipates certain rebuttals to his argument, but he silences them by beginning his arguments with, "It is true." Where is the support? Okay. What's the beginning part? Yep. He wants the African American people to know that he too realizes the problem with the government, but he is still willing to go to war. Purpose. So again, notice the variety, right? Support, purpose, insight. Support, purpose, insight. Support, or purpose, support, purpose. Right? Notice the variety. It's not the same. So notice the colors on the front and the back, right? Just by looking at the color coding, we're not color coding every other sentence, right? Like we're having some insightful look into our own writing. Okay, so look at that next paragraph. Although Green does make certain condescending arguments towards the white audience by the end of his speech, he has united both African Americans and whites by focusing them against a common enemy, the South. I would say that's purpose, yes. But notice this is the conclusion, right? So we always want to know how to write a conclusion. Notice that is his big picture. So really, this is the big idea. Wouldn't you say? His whole speech is ultimately to unite them against a common enemy. He does want change, but he knows that defeating the Southern slavery system is much more pressing and important in the long run. I would say that's kind of insight. Green is careful to hope of the future, but still improve the present, and he hopes not only the African Americans, but also the whites will do the same. I would say it's insight, but notice here, even though this is the language, right? Again, this is the writer using the language of the speaker to support their big idea. Okay, perfect timing. So here's what you have to do. You ready? This weekend, you have to SPI your paper. Right? And I need all my marks that I've made. Your paper needs to look the same. Okay? Then you need to fix all of it. And there's probably a lot to fix. And then you need to submit it to turnitin.com. And then you need to bring me a copy with your original. All these instructions are online.